Every living creature grows older at the same pace. A second is still a second, and a year is still a year, yet our minds experience time very differently. Think back to being 9 years old, when a single week of summer vacation could feel endless and remain vivid in your memory for years. Now compare that with adulthood, where an entire week at 40 can disappear before you even realize it has passed. Nobody really prepares you for that moment. One day you simply notice that life seems to be moving faster, and by then the feeling is impossible to ignore. This isn't just nostalgia playing tricks on you. It's biology shaping the way your brain experiences time. For a 5-year-old waiting for a birthday, that event represents nearly 20% of everything they consciously remember living through. For someone who is 40, waiting for the exact same occasion means anticipating only around 2.5% of their conscious life. Your brain doesn't measure time the way a clock does. Instead, it judges time through proportion. As your years accumulate, every new year becomes a smaller fraction of your total life experience. Mathematically, time hasn't changed at all. Psychologically, however, it absolutely feels like it speeds up, and that's only the beginning of the story. For most people, the years between 15 and 25 become the most deeply engraved period of adult memory. Psychologists even have a name for this phenomenon: the reminiscence bump. During those years, almost everything feels unfamiliar, exciting, or meaningful. Because of that, your brain stores those experiences with far greater detail than ordinary routines. Looking back from the age of 25, those 10 years seem incredibly long and packed with memories. Looking back from 45, the most recent decade often feels as if it vanished in the blink of an eye. Not because you experienced less life, but because much of that life followed the same familiar patterns, and that process is affecting you right now. Every morning that looks almost identical to the previous one, every week that brings nothing truly different. Your brain quietly compresses those experiences together. Instead of treating them as separate memories, it files them away as a single, repeated pattern. That's why you struggle to remember them individually. Your brain never stored them as separate moments in the first place. It grouped them into one continuous block of repeated information. And before you notice it, entire months can disappear without leaving much of a trace. But that's still not the strangest part. There's another phenomenon known as the temporal telescoping effect. When your brain tries to place past events on a timeline, it doesn't do it with perfect accuracy. Instead, it compresses recent years while stretching memories from the distant past. Something that actually happened 3 years ago can honestly feel as though it happened only a few months back. Your mind doesn't preserve a perfectly ordered timeline. It creates an edited version instead, constantly reorganizing memories based on how emotional or unusual they were. And without realizing it, you make decisions using that edited version as if it were completely accurate. How many times have you confidently said, "That happened about 2 years ago," only to discover it was actually 5? Exactly. Once you put all of these pieces together, one uncomfortable question naturally appears. If the amount of time you feel you've lived doesn't match the amount of time that has truly passed, then how trustworthy is your sense of who you are today? Your identity, your choices, even your feeling that you either have plenty of time or almost none at all. How much of that picture is being shaped by a brain that's quietly distorting your perception in real time? There isn't a simple answer. Back in 1975, psychologist Paul Fraisse published what would become one of the most influential works ever written on human time perception. After spending decades studying how people experience duration, he reached a remarkable conclusion. Our perception of time isn't controlled by an accurate internal clock. Instead, the brain builds that experience using two key ingredients: the emotional intensity of an event and the amount of new information it contains. Without emotion and without novelty, time leaves almost no trace. And if the brain leaves no trace behind, it's almost as if that time never truly existed. In 2019, researchers at the University of California, Berkeley, published findings explaining how the hippocampus shapes our experience of time. Rather than recording time itself, the hippocampus records meaningful events. And when nothing new happens between those events, it records almost nothing at all. From the perspective of measurable brain activity, time practically disappears whenever there is no fresh information to process. The implication for your everyday life is surprisingly direct. The days when you repeat yesterday's routine don't just feel identical. To your brain, they essentially are identical. 5 years from now, you probably won't be able to separate those ordinary days from one another. Not because your memory failed you, but because there was simply nothing different for your brain to preserve. Now, the most common explanation for all of this deserves to be presented exactly as researchers describe it. The standard theory argues that the feeling of time speeding up is simply a mathematical consequence of getting older. When you're 10 years old, 1 year represents 10% of your entire life. By the time you reach 50, that same year accounts for only 2%. Because of that, every new stretch of time naturally feels shorter compared to everything you've already lived through. This theory is supported by a substantial amount of scientific evidence. It explains why summers seem endless when you're a child. It also captures the overall pattern that most people experience throughout life. For many researchers, that explanation is enough, but it still doesn't answer every question. It doesn't explain why two people of the exact same age, living nearly identical routines, can experience time passing at completely different speeds. It also fails to explain why certain chapters of adulthood suddenly seem to slow down again without any meaningful change in age. Imagine someone who has spent years doing the same job. Then, during one particular year, they decide to learn an entirely new skill. Many people in that situation report that the year felt noticeably longer than the ones before it. Their age didn't change in any meaningful way. Something else clearly did, and that's exactly where the standard explanation begins to leave unanswered questions. The proportional theory remains a strong starting point, but recent research suggests there's another important variable that can't be ignored. It isn't enough for new experiences to simply happen to you. What seems to matter is whether you were the one who chose to create them. Early evidence suggests that memories formed as the result of your own decisions leave nearly twice the imprint compared to events that simply happened by chance. If that's true, then your perception of time depends on more than how much novelty you experience. It also depends on how much novelty you actively create yourself. Scientists still haven't reached complete agreement on the exact mechanism behind this process. There is no universal consensus yet, and it's likely that the feeling of time accelerating will never disappear completely. A brain that has already experienced decades of life naturally has fewer surprises left to encounter. That's not something you can fix with a vacation or a list of New Year's resolutions. but the speed at which life seems to move isn't completely locked in. It doesn't appear to be determined by age alone. At least part of it seems to depend on how much of your life is driven by your own choices instead of simple routine. Maybe the feeling that time is slipping away isn't simply a flaw in the way we perceive reality. Perhaps it's your brain trying to tell you something about the balance between what you create and what you merely consume. If time seems to stretch whenever your brain has something fresh and meaningful to record, then the amount of time you truly feel you have may depend, at least in part, on what you choose to do with the time that remains. And if you never make those choices, your brain has very little reason to create lasting memories. You already know where that path leads.